Welcome to the Kinkology podcast. This is your host, relationship and sex therapist, Hailey Rose Friedman, and this is your permission slip to stop shoulding all over yourself, let go of shame, and learn to embody your most authentic sexual self. It's so funny to go from like the shit show that was just the last 10 minutes of me trying to figure out how to work this recording system to now like super serious podcast mode.
Professional hat on.
Professional podcaster. Hi, I'm so happy to see you. I'm so excited that you're my first guest on the Kinkology podcast.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. This is the fusion of like two of my favorite worlds combined, so I'm pretty jazzed about it.
I love that. Yeah. For anybody that doesn't know, Hailey Magee is a certified coach who helps people around the world break the people-pleasing pattern and master the art of self-advocacy. Her debut book, Stop People Pleasing and Find Your Power, was released by Simon & Schuster in May 2024. Hailey is dedicated to offering clear, research-supported strategies for change, helping recovering people pleasers rediscover not only their power and agency, but their pleasure, joy, and sense of wonder. And she's also been my friend on Instagram for a while, and I love her work. And I have actually asked some clients to read her book and seen the transformation and the work that it facilitates. And I'm obsessed, and I'm so excited to have her on as my first guest on the Kinkology podcast because we've been on sort of parallel journeys with our people pleasing and our journeys as subs in the kink community. And I'm just so stoked to have this conversation with you.
I'm so jazzed. It's going to be so good. It's true. We have been on parallel paths, actually. I love that.
Yeah. It's funny. Sometimes I really hate Instagram. And then sometimes I'm like, but I wouldn't have all these cool people and connections that have been facilitated by social media. So, love, hate.
Yep. Right there with you.
So tell me, I'm curious, what has your journey been like, personally and then also professionally, being kinky, coming out kinky, and then deciding to come out more publicly? What has that process looked like for you?
Yeah. It's interesting because I think, personally, I feel like I've been like kinky since the womb. It's something that was present for me like from the very beginning, my earliest ways of conceptualizing, sex and intimacy and relationship and everything. But I would say I never had a formal coming out process about the fact that I'm kinky. I think because a lot of my working with folks on people pleasing centers a lot around authenticity and self-advocacy and doing your best to invite yourself to the table fully, I've kind of just alluded to it and dropped details into my writing and my posts and my suggestions for folks. So it's been a really organic kind of like slow trickle process. And while there have been the occasional folks who get a little spicy about it and don't love it and see Hailey professional and Hailey kinky as two worlds that can't coexist. It's actually been really nice because I've ended up working with a couple clients who are also kinky, and we get to talk about, how embodying your sexuality fully is a form of self-advocacy. So it's just been like a slow trickle for many years, really.
I really resonate with that, and I love that phrase, bring your full self to the table. I haven't heard anybody say that before, and it's very yummy. I resonate with that slow trickle. I think for me, I had a moment where I live in LA, but all my clients I work remotely with in New Jersey. And so I never have this, and I work with kinky clients, and so I have this privilege of not really worrying about running into my clients in the kink space, which a lot of kinky therapists have to really navigate. But I had this moment where I wanted to teach an in-person class like a workshop because I just missed being with people. And then I really had to sit with, okay, if I'm showing up in a kink space as myself, both as a therapist and as a kinky person, that really does smush my two worlds together. And how am I going to feel about that if somebody that knows me as an educator or a therapist finds my FetLife profile or swipes on my Field profile? And I really had to process that. And it can bring up a lot of shame or discomfort for me, at least, that it was really helpful to have that trigger to then work through it. But I mean, it still comes up as I even step into this project, trying to figure out what are my boundaries about sharing about myself and what's the difference between privacy and secrecy.
Oh, that's such a good question. I have always been so fascinated by how therapists navigate this because, I live in Seattle, and the kink community is very small, and there's a huge overlap with like the mental health community. And so I know a lot of therapists are in real time kind of talking with clients about like, all right, if we see each other in a kink space, here's the protocol. And I wish I could be a fly on the wall for those conversations because it sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's a fun complexity. So did your people-pleasing tendencies ever flare up around the idea of coming out at any point? Or just keeping your kinks hidden, or did that play into it?
Yeah, I think sometimes, those of us who grapple with people-pleasing can, over-index on like how we're perceived externally. So there'll be a lot of rumination and worry about how do people see me? Do people like me? Do people approve of me? Right? That's kind of like the ticker tape running through the people pleaser inner monologue. And so, yeah, and I think that's a mixture of, and I don't want to pathologize it either because we live in a culture that's, not always receptive to kink. And so it was a mixture of personal concern and also very real concern socioculturally. But I would say that eventually, just as a sex positive person in general, I do end up working with clients who struggle with people pleasing in sexual contexts, sort of boundary setting, being forthright about desires and interests. And so to me, again, it just sort of seemed like I don't want to have to relegate this part of my identity or like exile it. You know what I mean? Like, and that's one of the privileges about being a coach in this area is that I do kind of get to bring my full self to the table, not to repeat that line, but like, and just frame that as like, this is what it means to let yourself be embodied and whole. So
practicing what you preach.
100%. And like, just like with people pleasing, like it means some people won't like you or approve of you, and learning to be tolerant of that and understand why that's okay is very much part of the process too.
But it's hurt so bad.
But it hurts so damn bad.
I hate being misunderstood. It is seriously one of my biggest triggers, and working with that is not misunderstood on a surface level, but you know what I mean? Like when someone really misunderstands you or your intention or the meaning behind your life. It's painful.
It's so painful. And I think those of us who exist online in any way like are confronted with that again and again and again. So we have endless opportunities to confront that trigger. Yeah.
Another fucking growth opportunity.
Oh, I'm good. I've had my dose. Thanks. Forever.
Right. My cup is full, man. You said something interesting about being a sex positive person in general. How would you define that? What is being sex positive in your world?
Oh, that's such a great question. I guess...
No, wrong answers only.
Yeah, I know this isn't necessarily the definition, but what I mean when I say that is just that I see sex and sexuality as an integral and valuable and like beautiful part of being a person. And that includes like asexuality, basically. Like any relationship we might have to sex and sexuality, I see as being part and parcel of what it means to be fully human. And so yeah, kind of like not shaming or relegating that side of us to the shadow, and like sort of speaking concretely about like, this is part of who we are. It's how we show up in the world. It's how we show up in relationship, and like holding space for that to be okay. It's kind of vague, but I guess that's what I mean when I say it.
I'm with you. It doesn't sound vague to me. I think we have, as a culture, like you said, pushed sex and sexuality into the shadow, so much so that I think we actually talked about this years ago when we did our Instagram live, when we talked about the pendulum swing and how we overcorrect. Yeah. And I think that when I say sex positive, a lot of the time the first thing people go to is, so you're a hoe and you just have sex all the time with anybody, and that's what it means to be sex positive. No, it means that your sexuality and your sexual identity is authentic to you. And like you said, if that means that you're asexual and you never have sex, then that's sex positive because you're being sexually authentic.
Yes.
So I love what you said about that.
Yeah, I love that nuance. Yeah, like you can be sex positive and asexual. You can be sex positive and celibate. It's kind of like, it's just like allowing that slice of the pie chart of life to exist and be vibrant in whatever way is most true for you.
Right. Okay, so how did you discover your kink in the womb? Tell us your history, whatever you want to share about it, and what was it like? Let me think about. I'm mostly very curious about the process of realizing that we're kinky, and then I think for a lot of people there's a shame to work through, or a figuring out of like, what the heck is this? So if there's anything you want to share around that process and experience as a people pleaser, I'm really curious. Recovering people pleaser.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you, when I was in the womb, swimming around in that amniotic fluid, I just knew. It's such a weird way of putting it. I'm so weird. But
it's a good visual.
Yeah, it's like, I'm so kinky.
Baby infants, fetuses have been recorded masturbating in utero. That is a thing. So you could have
I was definitely that fetus.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's really okay. Fun fact. I'm adding that to my like fun fact deck for hanging with friends.
It's a good one.
Yeah. But like, I'd say for me, my earliest fantasies involved kinky elements. Like, and it's funny because I can't even remember having fantasies that didn't involve things like, group sex or dom-sub dynamics, power dynamics, even like, a bunch of stuff like that. And I just have all these memories of even like zoning out in like 4th and 5th grade. The teacher's trying to teach us like multiplication, and I'm looking out the window thinking about, gangbangs or something.
That's amazing.
It's hilarious. It was so... it was just kind of embedded in me from a pretty young age. And I'll say I got kind of trolled by Kink. I can't remember if I've told you this story, but it's kind of a hoot. So when I was young in elementary school, I was really into Mad Libs. Mad Libs are?
Who wasn't?
Right,
Mad Libs are just peak elementary school.
Elementary school, millennial life. And so for those who may not be familiar, like with Mad Libs, you fill in the blanks. It'll say a noun, say an adjective, and you fill in the blanks, and then they spit you back this story. And it's all very fun. And the stories are about aliens landing on Earth or dogs running through the park or whatever. So we had just gotten a computer in the house because, turn of the century or whatever. And I was trying to find, I looked online to see if I could do Mad Libs online.
Was it Ask Jeeves? Did you ask Jeeves about Mad Libs?
I probably asked Jeeves. Yeah, probably. And Jeeves hooked me up because I got directed to this site. I'll never forget. It was called eLibs or something. And there were all these categories you could pick from. So like, girls, boys, animals, outer space. And I picked girls because I'm a girl. And it spit me out this Mad Lib, and I put in the answers, and I swear to God, Kaylee, when I hit enter, it spit me back like a 20-page erotica story.
What?
It was so graphic and so intense, and I didn't know what I was walking into. I wasn't actively looking for erotica or porn, but you can believe that my 10-year-old or 11-year-old self was like, what is this?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I got trolled, and I'm going to be honest, like, I think that, as funny as it sounds, like, that website and these stories totally embedded in my sort of like fantasy profile. And that's kind of my honest story of how I think it got seeded in a lot of ways. So that's the origin.
Thank you for sharing your origin story. I love that. Oh my God. Ask so Jeeves rich. Trolled you into kink. That's amazing.
No, we can credit him with so much, you know. And then, like, as it relates to the process of owning kink and shame, to my knowledge, I didn't feel super ashamed of the fact that I was into, like, right away, I was submissive and I was interested in some more intense expressions of power dynamics. And I'm not sure why, because I experience a lot of shame in many other areas of my life. So it's really interesting that this one was, you know, not necessarily part of it. I'd say, you know, up until college, I had like some boyfriends, but I didn't have sex until I graduated high school. And then in college, at the time I went, it was very sex positive, and people, you know, I mean, people were handing out vibrators in the cafeteria, and it was very, very much this environment of whatever your sexuality is and how that, you know, presents for you, go get it. And I think that helped me own, like, okay, I'm kinky and this is just a natural expression. And, you know, shortly after that, I actively started pursuing partners who shared, you know, my affinity for DS. So I think I was helped along the way to not feel like shame in my sexuality.
I love that for you. I'm so happy to hear that was your journey. And it sounds like you had a lot of folks and communities reflecting sex positivity back to you, which is relatively rare experience, I think, when we think about like sex education.
Exactly. Yeah, it was like reflected back in a positive way. And even my family of origin, it was pretty open. Like, we weren't talking about kink by any means, but like sex itself was, you know, present. So yeah.
Oh, good. We love to hear that. Yay for the sex positive family.
Heck yeah.
So as you got more into kink, what was it like going from acknowledging you're a kinky person with kinky fantasies, maybe having some experiences with some partners, a transition from that personal experience to community, BDSM community, or realizing there's a whole community with a culture around it, and kind of like getting into the world of BDSM? What has that journey been like for you?
Yeah, it's an interesting one that I still feel is like unfolding in its own way. But, you know, what was this? 7 years ago or so, you know, I was using Field. I had finally started identifying kink is important to me. I'm a sub. I want DS to be part of my liaisons with people. And so had some great interactions like that. And then I was invited to, you know, sort of like a rope class. And I think that was my first, you know, it was interesting, right? Because up until that moment, my kink experiences had been sexual. Like, it was in a sexual context. We were doing sexual acts. They were woven together. But this rope class, it was a Midori class. And, you know, folks of all ages, all genders, and, like, all relationships represented. Like, there were plenty of tying pairs that were friends or were community members. And it was such a shift in my thinking, because I was like, oh, kink in this world can exist outside of doing sex. For lack of a better way of putting it. And it kind of blew my mind. And, you know, after that, you know, everything from like fetish events and sex clubs and tying parties and all that, it just became more and more apparent that the gradient that can exist in kink is so vast. And I think, you know, I'll be honest, there have been times when I've struggled with the quote unquote community aspect of kink too, because I'm someone who, I'm sensitive to feelings of belonging. I feel like in community, when I feel like I'm similar to everyone else and I really fit, that feels really good. And then there are some times when I'm in communities where I feel really different, or I feel like I don't fit, and that can feel hard. And there have been times in kink spaces where I'll go through cycles where I don't feel very sexual, or I'll go through cycles where DS isn't feeling very compelling to me, or I'm not feeling very outward and expressive in a sexual way. And there have been times when that has made existing in the kink community hard, not because people are necessarily saying, Hailey, you don't belong here, but feeling sometimes a internal pressure to be very sex forward when I'm not always feeling like that. So my relationship to the community is kind of complicated, but it's not bad.
That really makes a lot of sense, and it's definitely giving me something to think about, because I also noticed that even at non-sexual events, I want to feel sensual. I want to feel sexy when I attend, even if it's a rope tying class or a share, or, something where everyone is fully clothed and sex is definitely not happening. There's still a sensuality. And if I'm PMSing and I feel bloaty and I just want to sit on my couch and eat cookies, I'm definitely not putting latex on and going dancing.
No,
so,
thank you. Yeah.
and then you can feel disconnected from a larger community if you're not in that mode. And sometimes that can last a lot longer than just a week of PMS. Maybe you're going through a season of your life where you just don't feel connected to that part of your identity as much. So I could see how that could feel complex.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because we all want to belong, and ideally we have like a secure relationship with the community. Like, even if I fade in and out, I'm still valued as a whole person. I'm still treasured for who I am. But when a community centers on a specific part of the self, when you are out of touch with that part of yourself, it feels hard, So
yeah. So on your journey, so what I'm hearing, sorry, I just put my therapist hat on. I'll try not to do that too much in podcast interviews, but if there's anything you share that feels too vulnerable later, we'll just delete it. Sure. I'm hearing that the kinky part of your identity is just a part of your identity. And I'm also hearing that when you make these choices of whether to show up to an event or not, there's a whole, I imagine, people pleaser, like recovering people pleaser process of dropping into your body and intuition and who am I going to disappoint, but I really want to see this person, but I'm not feeling like doing this activity. And I want to hear more about how having to make those choices has probably, I would imagine, made you better at boundaries, and then maybe where it's like more challenging. I don't know. What does that bring up when I ask that? I'm curious.
Oh man. Just like racing hard.
No. Okay.
Not in a
Breathe.
bad way. Yeah, right. Right. But it's great, because I do think that those spaces and this community has been a crash course in boundary setting. I think one of the beautiful things about kink spaces is that they buck traditional norms, obviously, right? Like, we've got people wearing different dress, we've got people engaging in different levels of activity, we've got different expression, and that's one of my favorite things about it. Like, I'll never forget the first time I went to even just here in Seattle, the Erotic Art Festival, which doesn't have any play. It's really just like an art community, and like watching that sort of vibrant, like, it was like the Wild West, in a beautiful way. I was so excited. And at the same time, I've learned that because the environment is so different, a lot of the typical like social scripts are not present. And so you could be walking into an event or a space and having a lot of folks, try to initiate play or conversation with you, or even you go in with a single partner and there's this list of activities you could do, and being able to say, hey, I'm into rope tonight, but not so much flogging. It's kind of like boundary opportunities at every turn. And it does require a real connection to self. I know I definitely had experiences in the early days where kink was new to me and I hadn't yet gotten quite so good at boundaries, and I definitely agreed to activities or events. I was just caught up in the whirlwind of novelty, but after, I remember feeling like, oh, that wasn't a hell yes. That felt kind of like I wasn't checking in with myself, for lack of a better word. So I'd say now some of the biggest takeaways I've learned from existing in this space is, first of all, like, I really value like proactive boundary setting and communication. Like, in order for me to enjoy being in a space, I kind of like to set up a container for myself in advance. Like, here's what I'm feeling open to tonight. Here's what I'm not. Sharing that with whoever I'm going with or whoever I may meet there. That creates a lot of safety for me so I can relax into the moment. And I can always adjust that in real time if I want to. But that really helps. And then also, like, it's just exposure therapy of like being able to reject in the moment or say I'm not interested in something, and repeatedly, many times it's been corrective because folks will receive that beautifully because they understand that that's what happens when you're in these spaces is like, rejection or turning down is part of that. So that's been hard. I'm not going to lie. It's been hard. At times it's tiring. Like, there have been times where like, I don't have the bandwidth to like say no a bunch of times tonight. So I might not go out tonight, but it's definitely gotten better with time.
So it sounds like when you are prepping yourself to go to an event, for example, there's a process that you go through where you really like drop in and get really clear about that container that you spoke about that you need to set preemptively for yourself. What is that process like? And do you have any tools or tips or ideas for people who would want to practice that? What are some good ways that you really get in touch with what that container needs to look like?
Oh, this is interesting. It's making me sort of think like, okay, what exactly do I do? The first thing I would say is just like, I start by committing to like radical self-honesty. So when I check in with myself, part of my self-care promise is that I listen to what's revealed. I have some, like so many of us, I have some sexual trauma in my past. And so there'll be times when it sounds great to go to an event, but a couple hours before when it's coming up and I check in, I might notice I'm feeling kind of activated or a little bit panicky. And so kind of committing to radical self-honesty and acting on whatever's revealed, even if that means canceling, which doesn't happen often, but it happens sometimes. And then I'd say, which I know this can be really tough for the recovering people pleaser, but giving myself permission to, like, in my own mind, access desire and ask myself if I were to design how I hope this night goes, like a daydream, like what would it entail? What am I really wanting tonight? And for me, that's a helpful practice to do alone before I'm interacting with anyone else, because then my desire isn't clouded by what I perceive as their expectations or their desires. And that helps me get clarity on what I'm really looking for. So yeah, checking in with the body, letting yourself daydream can be a really nice way of seeing what you want.
I love that. I think I like the two-parter of the landing with yourself and being really willing to listen, and then the daydreaming aspect, which I think I'll speak for myself as also a recovering people pleaser. When I am imagining possibility, a huge and weighty part of my data set is other people's needs, feelings, what I know about them, what I think their expectations might be, etc., etc. And so to intentionally do this sort of fantasizing or ideating without the weight or what's the word I'm thinking of? Without the weight or the barriers of what's actually possible gives you such a great starting point to then figure out what is possible. But if I skip the part where I give myself free rein and I'm not considering all the data of everyone around me, then I actually miss a lot of my own insight and desire. And
Yeah, that hits, that completely describes my experience too. You know what I mean? And so many folks I work with. And sometimes, like, to really solidify what you're saying, like that permission to daydream, I'll sometimes invite clients to say, like, if I had some sort of cosmic guarantee from, like, the universe or God or whatever, that whatever I said I wanted to do would be received enthusiastically by everyone around me tonight, what is it that I'd say I want to do? And that just it sort of breaks people pleasing in the mind and creates access to desire. And of course, like, people may not want to do what you decide, and people may not want to play the way you want to play, but then at least that can be a negotiation that happens between two people instead of a self-censorship that happens in the mind.
You mean playing Barbies by myself in my room in my own mind doesn't actually give me a good idea of what's possible?
Love that image.
I call it playing Barbies because I imagine myself, then they're going to say this and I'm going to say this. And it's just this whole fantasy.
Oh my God. I've played out hours this way. Yes.
Right. Okay. So in this process, and we talked about that pendulum swing, the overcorrection. Do you ever feel like your boundary, that container that you create for yourself, becomes too rigid? Does it ever feel like you're stuck in it?
Honestly, not yet. And I think that's because part of the container is permission to change in real time if it's coming from a place of desire. Like, really, the container is for me to feel safe and to feel like I'm not pushing myself beyond my capacity. But then in a moment, I can definitely think of moments where I've gone into an event being like, all right, I'm only doing rope tonight. But then we're there and the music's playing and I'm feeling myself and I feel so good and I'm getting turned on. And then it's kind of like, okay, let's act on this. Let's take this to the next level in whatever way feels best for us right now. And that's a great practice too, because it's kind of like, the whole point of the boundary is to feel safe and comfortable and aligned. And if in the moment I'm like, oh, I could do this other action and maintain that ground, that's what I want. So I do think it requires a certain degree of self-trust to kind of be flexible with boundaries, which tends to be the case like across the board. Like, sometimes we need those rigid containers to develop enough self-trust to then say, I trust myself to be flexible and attuned in the moment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a long process of, for me, I noticed creating really hard and fast rules, because then that made me feel like I had predictability. But then they were just as inauthentic to how I was actually feeling in the moment as not having boundaries.
Oh my God. Right? It can then feel just like this, like you use the word cage, like a cage you created for yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So if someone has a history of people pleasing and they're maybe newer in the kink space, what are some ways that you think people can differentiate between healthy kink dynamics and more manipulative or unhealthy ones?
I think maybe I'll keep my answer relatively simple, because there's like one glaring answer that pops up for me, and it all has to do with open and intentional communication about boundaries and limits and respect for that. Like, to me, that is absolutely fundamental. And I can think of early on in my involvement in kink, I would be interacting with partners who would basically just be like, oh, you're a sub, I'm a dom, we good, like, let's go play. You know, and it's
red flag.
Red flag. Right. And I think that's an easy trap. I think especially as someone who is submissive, who is seeking safe containers where I can acquiesce power, I definitely fell into that a couple times. You know what I mean? Because I was like, oh, they're a dom, so just by nature of assuming this title, they'll take care of me. And it took, it sucks. It took a couple experiences to be like, all right, the ownership of that label, it doesn't necessarily have to mean anything. And a true Dom, or a Dom with whom I'm comfortable interacting, is one who is going to initiate conversations about boundaries and limits, and not push, not nudge, just listen. Like, nudging and pushing maybe can happen in play if you have a pre-negotiation of that happening. But I also remember times where I'd be interacting with Doms and I'd be saying some boundaries and limits, and they would kind of cajole or gently urge me, but come on, like, I've known some submissives who really do this. You know, I know. And
all the red flags.
All the red flags. And I know it's like, I promise there are good ones out there. But yeah, through all of these experiences, they're really instructive, because I think, one more thing on that vein too, is like Doms who will receive your boundaries and limits with enthusiasm, you know, not just resigned acceptance, which can be like a really subtle, it can feel almost corrosive, like, oh, okay, right? Which red flag also, it gives you pause, as opposed to like, thank you for telling me your limits, because now this means I can trust you, and it means we're going to have a connected and safe experience together.
So that brings up such a interesting part of the dynamic that I've been noticing and talking to folks about, is that like, when we are talking about negotiation, boundaries, safety, and then people pleasing, where and by we I just mean like in people in the kink education space. This is, you know, a pretty popular topic, but I've noticed that whenever we're talking about it, it's always about the submissive partner being a people pleaser and protecting the submissive partner. And I'm curious what you think about, can Doms be people pleasers, and how do you think that could show up?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, and thank you for naming that, because that was kind of a thing happening in my own mind that I wasn't even aware of. So I have some deprogramming to do around that. But yeah, I mean, I'm thinking especially, you know, I'm thinking of a lot of Doms I know who take their role very seriously and very meaningfully, and they see it as central to their role to provide their sub with a positive experience, a pleasurable experience. And at times that can mean, you know, a Dom sort of prioritizing the sub's pleasure or fantasy over what intrinsically feels good to them, you know, or is a yes for them. Like, just because you're a Dom doesn't mean you're going to be on board with all forms of sadistic play or all forms of role play. And there is, you know, in the same way there's a difference between being a people pleaser and being properly submissive, I'd say there's a difference between being a nurturing and caregiving Dom and being like a people pleaser, like just accommodating whatever the sub wants at the expense of yourself. So like, in short, yes, this can totally happen. And I think it's less addressed because we see Doms as the power wielders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a misconception, especially, and, you know, not to be so gendered about it, but gendered, being raised in a specific gender does teach us certain cultural norms. So I have noticed that with femdoms and male submissives, there's often a dynamic where the male submissive is sort of just like ordering off a menu about what they want to experience. And because we have this dialogue going in the larger community, that it's all about the submissive and it's all about their pleasure and their safety and giving them what they need, I think that can get really messy and confusing for a top or a Dom who's in those people-pleasing tendencies, and then they're just, fulfilling their partner's fantasies without, Doms also need to have boundaries, their own boundaries, true. Right?
Yes, and I think to that point, too, a true negotiation in the beginning would involve, ideally, the sub would also be able to ask about that, right? Like, what are your boundaries? What are your yeses, your nos, your maybes? Like, I truly think this should be a reciprocal dialogue the best it can be.
Yeah, what do you have any ideas, or what do you think we could do for each other that would make it feel safer for everyone to share their boundaries with each other?
So I think offering a broader framework for the boundaries would make everyone feel safer. And what I mean by that is, like, a boundary isn't just a limit or a rejection or a ceiling. Like, really naming that boundaries are just tools in service of a connection that is safe, connected, and transparent. And, like, really seeing boundaries as an act of care for both people. And remembering that someone doesn't want to accidentally trespass your boundaries. Like, that's painful for people to realize, oh God, I did something that they didn't like, but I didn't know. So when you're sharing a boundary with someone, you're offering them care and preventing them from the experience of accidentally going somewhere they don't want to go. I think that would really help people, because it really shifts it, right? From, like, I'm setting a boundary with you and so I'm rejecting you, to, like, we're collaborating with mutual care. And then I also think, like, I know this sounds kind of corny, but it's been so corrective and healing for me, is encouraging people to respond to others' boundaries like they've been given an act of care, like celebrating it, really giving that positive reinforcement of, like, thank you so much for telling me that. Like, I don't know. That's been so healing for me.
Oh my gosh, I know. How corrective is that when you work yourself up to saying, like, I don't want to do this. And the person is like, good job.
Right?
Thank you for telling. You're like, oh God, thank God.
Right? You could even lean in. You could be like, good girl. Like, you told me your boundaries. Like, whatever you want to do with that. It's so... I remember in the beginning when I heard that a couple times, I was like, I didn't believe it. You know, I was like, are you serious? You're really giving me this feedback? And they're like, no, really. Like, thank you.
Yes. All the praise for all the boundaries in both directions.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. What pops into your brain when I say the phrase empowered submission? What might that entail?
What comes to mind first is a submission coming from a place of connection to inborn desire. Again, sort of making that distinction between, like, I'm doing this to please you even though I don't want to, or it feels bad, versus I'm doing this to please you because part of my desire profile is to please you. Like, that really is different.
So if you care to share, what are your personal signs, thoughts, emotions, physical sensations that you notice when you're in authentic submission that's different from when you're in people pleasing?
Ooh. Oh God, everything's different. So I'd say, authentic submission, there is a presence that I feel. Often there's, like, desire, like, I'm aroused at what's happening, and that arousal is, like, building. It's not being derailed by things being suggested. Like, it's like, oh, that was suggested. I like that. It's hot to me. And I'd say the biggest thing, and this applies to sexual people pleasing, but all people pleasing, is that my outsides are matching my insides. There's not a feeling of dissonance or performance necessarily. It's like, okay, yeah, the enthusiasm I am expressing to you or showing to you is sincere. When I'm in a people-pleasing, submissive place, there's a lot going on. Like, usually, first of all, there's some sort of body signal that this isn't what I actually want. Whether that's, like, I'm getting less turned on, I notice I'm super up in my head all of a sudden, I'm overthinking, I'm ruminating, or, my heart starts beating faster. I feel like I'm, like, hunching I feel like unsafe somehow. Not necessarily because the other person is making me feel that way, but because my body is picking up on, like, we don't like this, And then the other thing is, my insides and outsides don't match when I'm people-pleasing, submissive. Like, I am expressing desire, or whatever, but inside, I'm either like, I don't love this, or I'm like, how can I try to convince this person that I'm enjoying myself? So it's a very dissonant feeling for me.
I resonate with that. It's kind of weird to bring up my mom right now, but I was at home visiting my parents. I promise this will make sense. And I had to make a phone call to advocate for a family member with a doctor kind of situation. And so I put on my like professional therapist sounding hat. Hello, yes, I'd like to speak to so-and-so. You know, like I had to put on the like, I need to talk to the manager voice.
Yeah.
And I hung up the phone and my mom turns to me and goes, wow, you're so calm and grounded. And I was so triggered and I was shaking and I was sweating and I was just like in a fawn response in a way. And I thought of that moment when you were sharing that is that there's that splitting almost, or like a disconnection or dissociation from what your body is doing and then what it looks like from the outside. That's such a huge red flag that I've learned to pay attention to for myself as well.
Oh, that's so well described. Yeah, it is like a splitting or a fracturing. And like, as you're describing it, it's really interesting because I'm reflecting, and I'm very honest about this because I wish it were talked about more culturally, but I'd say like the first many years of my sexual experiences felt like that. Like there was such a preoccupation with like externalities and performance and just like a real denial of everything that was going on inside me. And I think it's incredibly common, and I don't know. Yeah, it's great to be aware of. Yeah.
I think that I'm going to get all like meta and existential here for a second, but I do think that the systems that we're a part of are, you know, school system, religious systems, governmental systems, capitalism, every single one of those systems benefits from separating us from our intuitive knowing. We're not going to spend money on dumb shit if we feel whole and connected and grounded. We're not going to, you know, sit through class when we know that we have to go pee and like be outside in the sunlight and talk to our friends because that's what our body needs at that moment. You know, we are not going to go to church every Sunday when we leave feeling full of shame and insecure and shitty about ourselves. Like none of these systems can exist if we're deeply connected to ourselves. And so we've been trained to split in that way by so many different systems our entire lives.
I want to hand you my mic so you can just drop it. Seriously. Yeah. Oh my God. That has got me. I'll be chewing on that for days. Thank you. That's so beautifully said. And you're right. Like, so many systems benefit from divorcing ourselves from our knowing and our power. So, which really makes it a pretty radical act to come home to it then.
Yes. So radical. So, speaking of coming home to it, tell people what you're offering and how people can learn some of these skills and operationalize all the theoretical things we've just been talking about. And, you know, you have so many courses and amazing workshops and your book, and just like give us a rundown. Where should people start? What would be helpful?
Word.
What are the tools?
Yeah, thank you. So when you go to my website, HaileyMagee.com, you'll see lots of different things. And the best place, there are two good places to start. The first one is my self-advocacy school program, which is a 22-course masterclass, self-paced. It walks you through so many incredible sort of like hands-on tools for releasing people-pleasing and mastering the art of self-advocacy in every possible context, including sexual. So that's a great home base to begin. And then really right now, I am just loving working one-on-one with clients and getting to do some of that deeper inner work of transformation. And so you can apply to be a private client on my website.
Yay. Anyone who gets a spot there is going to be definitely lucky and expanded and transformed. Do it. Everybody sign up. Thank you so much for being here. This was a really fun conversation, and I cannot wait to hear people's reactions and responses and reflections, and continue the conversation. And maybe people will even ask enough questions that we can do a part 2.
Oh my God. I wish. Come on, send them in, people.
Let's do it. Wait, let's make a goal. If we get how many questions or comments on the episode, then we do a part 2.
How about 20?
I love that. Okay, guys. That's
20.
It.
Let's go.
That's the deal. 20. Thank you, Hailey.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye. I have a few asks for you. Please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to it so you don't miss any of these juicy conversations. If you enjoyed the episode, as always, rate and review it. If you didn't enjoy it, keep it moving. Share the episode with one friend or partner. And finally, and let's keep this conversation going. Follow me on Instagram at Kinkology Thank you for listening. And remember, you deserve to live boldly, love deeply, and kink authentically. Stay curious, friends.